What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my own personal Game of the Year awards for 2024, talking about the games of various genres that I personally enjoyed the most, because as it stands, right here towards the end of the year, I've reviewed somewhere around like the mid-50s in terms of games this year, so I'll have to actually count up the full number when I get around to ranking all of them a little later, but that's just the games I've reviewed, let alone the games I have played, so naturally, some of those stood out more so than the others, which is ultimately what we're here to talk about today. And from there, we're going to dive right into it with our first category, the indie games. So what was my favorite indie game this year? This would simply have to go to Another Crab's Treasure. An indie Soulslike meets 3D platformer. Another Crab's Treasure puts us in the role of a hermit crab looking to get his shell back after it is stolen. So as you might imagine, it's a very comedic kind of game. But on top of that, it's also a very competent Souls-like. On one hand, that has all the challenge you could ask for, but on the other, it also has a ton of accessibility options up to and including just letting you equip a gun and one-shotting everything. So if you get tired of being pummeled to death by various sea life, you can in fact just pull out a gun and win, which in my own review I referred to as rage winning, which was a really fun time. Now, to top all of that off, I think the story of Another Crab's Treasure is surprisingly good. I know it hit me right in the feelings, for sure, and while I played quite a few great indie games this year, I would say Another Crab's Treasure really just does take the cake in terms of my own enjoyment, and thus, I have to give it the award for this category. Keeping it moving though, next up we have our action games. There were quite a few great action titles this year, with many of them naturally also kind of taking up space in other genres as well. Souls-likes are a natural fit here in many ways. Depending on how loose with it you want to get, you could realistically lump action adventures in here, sure. But ultimately, one of these games has to win, and in terms of the action game I simply had the most fun playing, would have to give it to Space Marine 2. Honestly, a game I wasn't even sure I was going to review at first, but after playing a little bit of it and having just a ton of fun, I knew I was definitely going to, especially since the multiplayer requirements were relatively tame. And since its release, they've been updating it and adding more content to play through, as it was a little light on content when it actually launched, but between blasting my way through hordes of Tyranids and later Chaos Space Marines, it's a game that keeps the adrenaline pumping, and when you finally think you've mastered that, you can swap over to the multiplayer side of things and take on other players, all in the name of the God Emperor of mankind. This game was just big, brash, and a ton of fun. My main gripe with it really was just that there wasn't quite enough of it, which is hardly the worst complaint you can have about a game. But that does bring us to our third category, which is the TRPG genre, tactical games, your strategy titles, more or less. There were a few of these released this year that were quite good, such as Tactical Breach Wizards, Capes, Crown Wars, Classified France 44, just to name a few, but ultimately only one can win, and I've got to give this one to Metal Slug Tactics, a tactics revival of the Metal Slug series, which I fully admit I'm not wildly familiar with, but I do know a lot of tactics games, and this one was a ton of fun. Bringing back series regulars, as I understand it, we'll take a team of 3 through a roguelike adventure on tactical missions that are all very quick and snappy, and each one of these characters has their own skill set, of course, but they all synergize with each other in really fun and interesting ways. So while the actual roguelike part of it can get a little routine pretty quickly, what kept me going through this one was just realistically how much fun messing around with and finding different combinations of abilities to use with all these guys was as you fight your way through all of these ridiculous boss fights. Ultimately, Metal Slug Tactics is just a fantastic tactics experience that managed to avoid getting a little too bogged down underneath its own system the way I felt with other TRPGs this year. So a well-deserved reward on that one, I think. Now for our fourth category, we have something a little different because it's not from me at all. This is the game my son enjoyed the most this year. Now truth be told, he's pretty caught up in Minecraft these days, but nonetheless, when I'm playing a relatively child-appropriate game, I will often show them to him at least to try to get him interested. Some of these he reacts to pretty well, others he's not interested at all. But I would say the game that caught my son's interest the most this year, that he actually played with me a fair bit, was a title called Sandland, a game that gets its art style from the late Akira Toriyama that puts you in the role of the fiend prince Beelzebub as you seek to find water in this desert environment, as the Sandland title might imply. And all along the way, we're going to be utilizing all sorts of vehicles and contraptions that will build up alongside a town we can build up, and Sandland was a great bit of fun. But what really pushed it over the top for me was just getting a chance to play it with my son and see his reaction to all these crazy vehicles and combat and stuff. He enjoyed it quite a bit, so my son's pick has to go to Sandland. But that brings us to my favorite Souls-like this year. I would say hit or miss genre for a lot of people. I enjoy Souls-likes quite a bit, as do many others, and I typically play the big ones at the very least when they drop, as we already saw with Another Crab's Treasure. I'm also willing to take a look at the odd ones. Now, for this particular category, I would say there is a very clear winner that stood pretty well head and shoulders above all the rest, and that is none other than Black Myth Wukong. A visual spectacle on top of some pretty fantastic reactive combat that feels very intense, to say the very least, which really drives that experience forward. Now, I will say that Black Myth has a few problems that keep it from being my personal favorite game of the year, which I outlined in the review for it, of course. But between the incredible boss fights, the breathtaking visuals, and the many discoveries to be had when it comes to this particular genre, I don't think anything quite measured up to Black Myth here. So it takes this particular category home pretty handily. But that does bring us to our DLC category, because personally, I would just put these in a separate category rather than nominating them for Game of the Year. But I will say, as somebody whose favorite gaming experience this year was in fact a DLC, I can't really blame the Game Awards for nominating one for Game of the Year themselves. But in all seriousness, bar none, my favorite gaming experience this year was Rogue Trader's Void Shadows DLC for the Warhammer franchise, and that DLC, on top of previous patches that brought that game up to speed from its launch day, really improved it. Now, I enjoyed it when it launched, but all these improvements and then a fantastic DLC on top of it really pushed it over the moon. And in fact, Void Shadows, which centers around a death cult on your Void ship that serves you as a character, and then how that rolls into the Gene Stealer cult aboard your ship, was just fantastic, and you get to see all of that alongside a brand new companion, and it's just a fantastic bit of DLC. And the fact that it is a CRPG, which is my favorite genre, made it pretty much a shoo-in, which is why I enjoyed it so much. Which is probably not a huge surprise, given that the channel is known primarily for my CRPG coverage. But that does bring us to our final entry, and this is, of course, my Game of the Year, the title I enjoyed above all of the others, largely as the best total experience for one reason or another. Now, as I'm sure many of the people who clicked on this video were expecting, given how, let's say, controversial my Veilguard review was, where I said it was my Game of the Year, and while I absolutely stand by that review, I think Veilguard is a great game, I did ultimately speak a little too soon, because a game I had kind of written off wound up wowing me much more than anything else did this year, and this was actually Indiana Jones and the Great Circle. A game I went into expecting a fairly linear, run-of-the-mill action adventure that was probably going to be decent but nothing to write home about, and instead I got a truly fantastic experience with great exploration, level design, and even the puzzles managed to be interesting. And while I would say that the enemy AI leaves a bit to be desired, if anything it kind of falls in line with how they acted in the movies anyway. A great story that kept me guessing right up until the end, the fact that you can keep playing after the story to go back and collect everything you've missed and explore all the very handcrafted side quests on top of just general discoveries, the fact that the puzzles have a variety of ways to help you get through them by either simplifying them outright or just using hints instead, but also most of the puzzles are pretty manageable anyway. They managed to really nail that sort of tightrope of puzzles being either way too complicated or way too easy, which was very surprising to me. You can kind of choose what you want there. The fact that the gameplay is so, I would say, just dynamic, I guess, in terms of how you approach things, going either full-on stealth or going in guns blazing or some combination of the two, using disguises. There's often many solutions to a given problem in a way that really kind of felt like an immersive sim. And so, for all of those reasons, despite my own biases getting the better of me for sure and kind of writing this game off before I had even fully played it, it surprised me in the best way, which is why, as far as full new game releases go, in 2024, this was absolutely my favorite. But obviously, that does not include every single game release that we saw, or game that I reviewed by far. So, in terms of that, if you're curious how those stack up, I will, as always, be doing my yearly ranking of every single game I reviewed, which is hardly fair given all the genres and everything, but that video is always really fun to make, so if you're curious how any of these games stack up against everything else I played, certainly subscribe and stick around. And while you're at it, maybe consider hitting like or leaving a comment, or if you absolutely hated everything about this, by all means, hit the dislike button. I get paid for that too. So with all of that said, truly, just thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.